What is the nature of existence? What is the nature of the things that exist? Does reality exist because we perceive it? Or does reality exist independent of our perception? These questions have been central to one of the most enduring debates in all of philosophy. Recently, a few contemporary thinkers are advancing radical and controversial new ideas on the subject. One such philosopher, Jeffrey Grubb, has written an extensive treatise entitled Mereological Nihilism, Quantum Atomism and the Impossibility of Physical Constitution. Through extreme physical reductionism, he has arrived at a denial of the independent existence of the reality that we experience, uniting ancient Greek and Indian Buddhist thought with the cutting-edge scientific revelations of quantum physics. Jeffrey Grubb aims to demonstrate that the reality we perceive isn't real. We tend to draw a distinction between material objects, such as the food that we eat or the pets that we own, and immaterial objects, such as concepts and ideas. Material objects clearly exist because they have readily apparent physical properties. We're able to touch, see, smell, or otherwise interact with them in some way. Immaterial things, such as ideas, do seem to exist, but not in any observably physical sense. Although ideas may ultimately be manifestations of physical things, such as chemical and electrical impulses within the brain, the idea itself exists metaphysically. It's not generally considered true, for example, to say that Harry Potter exists. Everyone will acknowledge that the character exists as a figment of people's imaginations, but few people would claim that Harry Potter, as described in the various novels and films in which he appears, is an actual living, breathing person. It's true then to say that Harry Potter exists as an idea, and only as an idea. A real person, such as Chuck Norris, is different in that he has a physical self, a body, including arms, legs, etc. Although Harry Potter and Chuck Norris are both widely recognizable characters, prevalent within contemporary pop culture, there's a clear distinction that can be drawn between the two. Chuck Norris is made up of physical material, and therefore real, whereas Harry Potter is not. What truly differentiates physical things, things which actually exist, from metaphysical or non-material things, things which do not actually exist, is that the former are made of physical stuff, whereas the latter are not. It would seem then that it is a fundamental and defining property of things which actually exist, that they are composed of physical material. The mereological nihilist argument is essentially that physical composition does not actually occur. As such, while there is such a thing as a physical reality, none of the objects we experience belong to it. To understand the case against the ideas of physical composition, we must first consider these ideas. In the reality that we experience, all things are made up of smaller pieces or parts. A zebra, for example, consists of a head, a tail, 4 legs, etc. These pieces in and of themselves are not a zebra. They are the things that make up the zebra. Looking closer, we see smaller pieces, such as a nose, eyes, and fur. Closer still, and we see living cells. But even these cells are made up of parts. The center of the cell is the nucleus, which contains the DNA. The DNA contains billions of pairs of nucleotides. Each nucleotide consists of 3 basic parts, each of which is a molecule. Each molecule is made of atoms. For any physical object that we encounter, there are billions upon billions of parts that make it up. In philosophy, the logic concerning the relationship between parts within a whole and the relationship of those parts to the whole is known as mereology. Mereology seeks to explain, for example, how it is that the pieces of a zebra come together to constitute a zebra. It's a fundamental assumption of physical existence that the pieces that make up the things around us come together in some way to compose the objects we experience. The process of examining the pieces of something for purposes of finding the smallest, most fundamental parts is known as reductionism. Noticing that things can be broken into smaller pieces, many philosophers postulated that there were such things as the smallest pieces, pieces so small and fundamental that they cannot be divided any further. A pre-Socratic Greek philosopher named Democritus called these smallest pieces atoma, and the belief that there are such things as indivisible, fundamental particles is now known as atomism. Democritus believed that atoms were permanent and unchanging, an assertion that Jeffrey Grubb categorically disagrees with. But where Grubb's atomism differs from Democritus, it finds remarkable similarity to certain Indian Buddhist traditions. Dharmakirti, a 7th century South Indian Brahmin, held that atoms were point-like and temporary pieces of energy. Not only does Grubb agree with this, but he also points out that it is astoundingly in line with modern quantum physical data. Although atomists posit a limit to reductionism, not all philosophers agree with this approach. Opposed to atomism is the theory of infinite divisibility, the idea that, no matter how small the piece, it can always be reduced further. Rupp does not consider this theory in his paper, except to point out that science has probed very deeply and seems to point strongly toward the conclusion that physical reality is atomistic. The atom, as it is known to science, was first discovered in the early 19th century and so named due to the belief that it was a fundamental, indivisible particle. Despite the fact that it was later discovered that atoms are not indivisible, but are rather composite particles, the term atom is still used today to describe those particles. To Jeffrey Grubb, it is the indivisible subatomic particles such as electrons and quarks that truly deserve the name atom. Grubb avoids confusing the philosopher's atom with the scientist's atom by referring to indivisible quantum particles as quantum abstract atoms, a term which he applies to any particle known or believed by quantum physics to be elemental instead of composite. Grubb argues from data collected by quantum physics that quantum abstract atoms are point-like and therefore cannot be divided. How exactly these particles allegedly come together to assemble the reality that we perceive is discussed by Grubb for purposes of refutation. Mereology holds that the objects we experience are composed of other objects, and that the identity of objects has to do with the parts that compose them. Grubb shows these concepts to be thoroughly problematic and demonstrates that these problems are widely ignored within Western philosophy. Central to Mereology is the idea that, although objects consist of parts, they have an identity which is in some sense distinct from its parts. In section 3 of his paper, Grubb provides a typical description of composition. If A and B compose the whole C, then it follows that A and B compose something, and if they do, then there is an entity, C, that A and B compose. He notes that this description implies that the whole C is something over and above its parts. To hold that the whole is in some sense distinct from its parts is to avoid reducing the object to a mere coincidence of parts, and thus maintain that there is such a thing as a whole. To demonstrate the problem with this, Grubb provides the example of a leafless tree as used by the British philosopher David Wiggins. To paraphrase this example, consider the tree and the molecules which compose it. The tree and the molecules are in the same place at the same time, as it's the molecules which make up the tree. Now the tree is only equal to the molecules if whatever is true of the tree is also true of the molecules and vice versa. It follows then that the tree equals the molecules only if the tree and the molecules have exactly the same properties, including those of persistence and survival through change. Imagine then that the tree is cut down and carefully broken apart such as to avoid damaging any of the molecules that compose it. It would seem in this case that the tree has not persisted, whereas the molecules have, therefore the tree and the molecules cannot be identical. The idea that a whole object is reducible to its parts but also somehow something more than its parts is a contradiction, one which Grubb notes is inherent in mereological theories of composition. Still, other problems with theories of composition exist, such as the problem of persistence through time. The material that allegedly composes the objects we experience, including our own bodies, is known to be ever-changing and shifting at the molecular and quantum level, while the composite objects do not seem to change. As demonstrated in the well-known story of the ship of Theseus, the persistence of the identity of composite objects, in spite of the fact that the materials of which they are composed do not similarly persist, is problematic. Grupp sees these and other problems with Mereology as insurmountable. It seems to him that the majority of Western philosophers are content to simply ignore these problems, have refused to take them seriously, and have, quote, instead all too often chosen to align themselves with ancient and pre-scientific metaphysical theories of reality that involve rather obvious and stark problems, antinomies, and paradoxes. Grupp rejects all theories of composition and believes that replacing nihilism to be the only coherent option. Central to his position is his redefining of the divisions of reality. He notes that reality is ordinarily viewed in terms of levels. The chemical level is made up of the particles of physics, the biological level is made up of chemicals, and so forth. Considering that this system of levels has to do entirely with the idea of physical composition, Grupp rejects it. Instead, he draws one line through all of existence and calls the two resulting sides Division 1 and Division 2. Division 1 reality is the reality of the non-composite, fundamental objects of the quantum world, whereas Div 2 reality is everything larger than the scientific atom. Div 1 reality is revealed through quantum physics and can never be directly experienced. Any and all experiences that humans have are experiences of Division 2 reality, which Grupp demonstrates can be reduced to experiences of surface and color. Smell is describable in terms of air surface hitting the inner nose surface. Hearing is describable in terms of an eardrum hitting a disturbed air surface. Taste is describable in terms of the surface of food hitting the surface of the tongue. Tactile experience is describable in terms of the interplay of surfaces, skin surface to surface of a physical object. Sight experience is describable in terms of experience of colors and surfaces, light reflecting off a surface. He holds that Division 2 experiences are illusory in that they are inventions of consciousness. To demonstrate this, imagine the example of an apple. If one were to hold the apple in their hand, they will experience it as a solid object. Examination on an atomic level reveals that the apple is almost entirely empty space. The apple is perceived to be red, when in fact red is not a physical property of the apple, but rather a figment of perception based on the interpretation of reflected light as received by the eye and transmitted to the brain. Considering that neither our sense of surface nor our sense of color accurately describe the apple to us, it would seem that we are incapable of perceiving the apple as it actually is. What is true for the apple is true for the world. The fact that Division 2 reality is allegedly composed of Division 1 reality is, to Grupp, absurd and impossible, considering that the two divisions are essentially the inverse of each other. In Division 2 reality, there is an apparent causal chain. Cause and effect seem to govern events. Due to the existence of cause and effect, the outcome of an event in Division 2 reality can be accurately predicted given enough good information. This is completely untrue for Division 1 reality, which contains randomness. Grupp cites quotations demonstrating this from numerous physicists, including a succinct passage from the physicist Herbert, who wrote, "The essence of quantum randomness is simply this: identical physical situations give rise to different outcomes." Additionally, objects within Division 2 reality have size, while quantum particles, as far as has been discovered, have no size whatsoever and are considered to be points. Electrons are in fact commonly referred to as point charges by physicists. These point-sized particles only exist momentarily and do not travel very far during their existence. Consider this quote from the physicist Ford. "For a particle, 1/100th of a second is an eternity. A gluon, the glue particle within a nucleus, lasts about that long between its creation and annihilation. A pion, a particle created in nuclear collisions, that moves a whole foot, has traveled nearly 1,000,000 billion times the diameter of a proton, and has taken a lengthy 10 to the negative 9 seconds to do it. Particles that live long enough to leave tracks in a detector have lifetimes of 10 to the negative 9 to 10 to the negative 6 seconds. Another fact of quantum particles which serves to contrast them from Division 2 objects is that they do not have a definite location. An electron, for example, has instead what is known as a probability distribution. It may be anywhere within a field of less and more likely locations. If the probability distribution of an electron happens to land the electron on the other side of an obstacle, the electron will simply appear on the other side of the obstacle, a phenomenon known as quantum tunneling. For a person, this would be like walking toward or standing by a wall and then suddenly being on the other side. Where Division 2 reality involves surfaces and colors, is predictable, and contains spatially extended objects that persist, Division 1 reality is precisely the opposite. At the quantum level, randomness permeates all. Objects are momentary. Surfaces and colors do not exist, and objects are without size or location. It's because of these and other contradictory properties that many view quantum physics as enigmatic and paradoxical. But the popular understanding of quantum physics is, according to Jeffrey Grupp, the result of amateurish interpretation of the data by a handful of prominent physicists. He notes that physicists have offered little in the way of conceptual interpretation of quantum physics, and have offered virtually no explanation as to how the quantum world somehow gives rise to the world we experience. Grupp holds that the quantum world only seems strange and impossible because it's held as fact that the macroscopic world which we perceive is real. We trust our perception too much to acknowledge the only reasonable conclusion. To Grupp, it is Division 2 reality which contains paradox and should be regarded as false. Through extreme physical reductionism, Jeffrey Grupp has arrived at a type of anti-realist idealism. Uniting modern physics with age-old Buddhist atomism, he's found cause to doubt the reality of the world we perceive. To Grupp, composite objects do not exist. Only the fundamental, sizeless Division 1 quantum abstract atoms exist. Since consciousness also exists, he reasons that consciousness must be a fundamental property of quantum abstract atoms, and therefore consciousness is reality. If his Mereological Nihilism is correct, then the world we experience is an illusion. Quantum abstract atoms do not in any way touch or come together to build or compose the objects we believe we experience. There is no space, there is no universe, there are no animals, people, or things. These things exist only as concepts, only as perceptual inventions of the consciousness which permeates all.